Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something we can all relate to. No, not the latest celebrity scandal, but the truly absurd world of Victorian women and the drug that sent them spiraling into madness. But don't worry, I'm not here to put you to sleep with boring history. Oh no, we're talking about a time when things were so out of hand that people thought using a certain medicinal substance would help them feel better, and instead they lost their minds. So before we get into it, take a second to like this video and subscribe. But, only if you actually enjoy the slightly offbeat history I'm serving up here. And while you're at it, comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. It's 2 a.m. somewhere, right? Now dim the lights, maybe throw on a fan for that cozy white noise, and get comfy. Let's pause and think about something. Ever wondered what it would be like to live in a time when leeches were considered a great medical remedy? What would it feel like to be told your hysteria was actually a medical condition and get prescribed a bottle of a certain numbing substance? What if, for once, the cure actually was worse than the disease? And most importantly, how did anyone manage to live without Pinterest to tell them how to fix everything in their life? Now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 19th century Victorian England. It's 1860, and the air smells like burning coal and desperation. And you, my friend, are about to experience the medical marvel that was laudanum. Enjoy the ride. Imagine stepping into your doctor's office in Victorian England. The shelves are lined with bottles of strange concoctions. Some look like they might cure a cold, others like they could cure, well, your entire existence. And sitting smugly on the most prominent shelf, gleaming under the dim light, is laudanum. This is the 19th century cure-all for everything from a bad cough to nervous disorders. Ever wonder what it feels like to live in a world where every ailment, no matter how small, is treated with a potion that could just as easily put you in a coma as cure you? Strap in. We're about to explore just how much trust the Victorians put in their medicinal beverages. You walk in and find yourself immediately surrounded by shelves that look like they belong in a mad scientist's lab. There's no Pinterest to guide them, no Dr. Google to reassure them, and no FDA to stop them from mixing up a few questionable ingredients and calling it medicine. Instead, every bottle is a mystery, every label a bold promise. For nervous afflictions, take 2 teaspoons every hour. For lack of sleep, just pour a glass and forget your troubles. It's like a bad vending machine in an apothecary's shop where every option could either cure your cold or knock you out for the rest of the week. But in this world, it's all about trust. After all, who else would you turn to for your health advice but the people who just so happen to sell you the cure? At the heart of this Victorian pharmacy was laudanum, the opium-infused potion that promised to relieve everything from a bad mood to a nervous breakdown. It was the Swiss Army knife of Victorian medicine, except instead of a nail file or scissors, it packed a punch of opium and alcohol. Imagine being a Victorian woman who might have just been told she's suffering from female hysteria, a condition that, spoiler alert, was basically just any woman who wasn't calm and polite enough for society's standards. And the doctor prescribes a dose of laudanum to help. In fact, if you had an issue that ranged from headaches to heartbreak, laudanum had you covered. It wasn't just a painkiller, it was practically a lifestyle. What's so wild about laudanum is that it worked, at least in the short term. It numbed the pain, quieted the racing mind, and lulled people into a trance of calm, until it didn't. The problem wasn't the drug's immediate effects. It was the long-term consequences that no one had fully reckoned with. But hey, it's the 19th century. Who needed a warning label when you had doctors writing prescriptions like they were ordering the latest fashion from Paris? And let's talk about the packaging for a second. Victorian medicine was as much about the look as it was about the effect. The bottles were beautiful, ornate little pieces of art that were designed to convince you that you weren't just drinking poison, you were indulging in a sophisticated remedy. No awkward plastic bottles here. This was glass, with labels that were half mystery and half promise. It's like they took one look at their chaotic, disease-ridden world and said, well, if we're going down, let's at least go down in style. But then there's the smell. Not just the laudanum itself, but the mixture of all those other remedies. The air in these rooms would have smelled like a curious blend of sick room, booze and burnt leaves, like a highly questionable cocktail for the soul. And trust me, the Victorian public didn't question it for a second. They were desperate for relief, so they trusted these potions like they trusted their mothers, blissfully unaware of the addiction lurking just beneath the surface. Here's the thing. The Victorians were completely convinced that medicine was a little bit magical. And when you look at the medicine cabinet, you can see why. There were bottles for ailments that modern medicine wouldn't even touch, from female complaints to anxiety. The concoctions they had would make today's wellness trends look like a walk in the park. You thought kale smoothies were a tough sell. Imagine having to convince someone that taking a daily swig of something that could knock you out for 12 hours was the healthy option. So, let's pause here for a moment. Have you ever taken a medicine so strange and seemingly miraculous that you've wondered if it was more about faith than science? Like, maybe, just maybe, the cure was less about what was inside the bottle and more about what you believed it could do for you. Victorian England would agree. Their medicine cabinets weren't just filled with tonics, they were filled with hope. And a little bit of the kind of hope that might just send you to sleep for a really long time. It was a time when they had no idea how addictive laudanum could be, no clue that it might lead to a society so dependent on the drug that entire generations would suffer. But they weren't thinking about that, were they? Instead, they were popping pills, drinking potions, and hoping the next miracle cure would finally do the trick. Laudanum might have been a temporary solution, but it was a reminder that sometimes in history, the answers are just a little bit more complicated than they seem at first glance. And just like that, you'd find yourself in a world of fancy bottles and dangerous cures, hoping against hope that this time the magic tonic would be the one that worked. Picture this. A Victorian woman, elegantly dressed in layers of uncomfortable fabric, sitting in a chair sipping on what she's been told will help her feel better. But what if, instead of curing her symptoms, it took her to places that no one should visit? This segment takes us into the lives of the Victorian women who were prescribed laudanum for everything from mood swings to menstrual cramps. They thought it was a miracle drug, but spoiler alert, it was actually the beginning of a steep decline. And guess who had no idea this was happening? That's right, everyone, including the doctors. Now, imagine you're a Victorian woman in the late 1800s, living in a world where society's expectations of you are the definition of unattainable. You are expected to be delicate, composed, and above all, perfect. And yet, there's that nagging headache, the constant fatigue, the overwhelming pressure of being constantly primped, poked and prodded to fit into this tiny little box of what a proper lady should be. You'd probably feel pretty out of sorts too, right? And so, your doctor, that ever-reliable source of wisdom, offers you a solution, a little dose of laudanum. It's not just for when you're sick, It's for when you're feeling anxious, sad, or just generally unwell with the absurdity of life. And why not? The Victorians had little concept of mental health, so when in doubt, laudanum it is. There's just one tiny problem. It doesn't solve your problems. It just makes them worse in a far more insidious way. You see, at first, laudanum seems like a miracle. It soothes the nerves, takes the edge off, and turns the world into a soft, floating haze. You feel light, unburdened, and for once you think, this is it. This is what it feels like to escape the weight of expectation. For a few hours, you're no longer the delicate flower in a cage of lace and bonnets. You're free. But soon, freedom starts to feel more like a trap. The doses that once brought you comfort begin to fade, and you find yourself needing more to reach that familiar place of euphoria. And so, your daily dose becomes a routine, something you rely on to simply function, not just to feel better. The worst part? No one really understands what's happening. The men in your life, husbands, doctors, brothers, don't get it. They still believe laudanum is the cure for all your woes. It's just a little tonic, they say, as they offer you another dose, unaware that it's slowly tightening its grip on your life. The doctors, they're all too eager to hand out prescriptions without ever fully understanding what laudanum does to a person. It's all so terribly civilized, isn't it? Just a little more of this miracle drug, and you'll feel better. You'll fit better into your corset of perfection. Except you won't. You'll just slip further and further away from yourself, trapped in a world of addiction that no one around you even knows exists. In fact, laudanum was so popular that it became a symbol of Victorian society's blind trust in quick fixes and miracle cures. At any given social gathering, a lady could casually pull out her delicate bottle of laudanum like it was just another fashionable accessory. It wasn't something to be embarrassed about. No. It was sophisticated. I'm taking care of myself, you see, she might say, as if this lovely little bottle was nothing more than a sip of tea. But, oh, the truth was much darker. The more you relied on laudanum, the more your world started to shrink. You no longer felt like yourself, but you also couldn't imagine life without it. And yet, even as the women of high society began to lose control, society around them remained blissfully unaware. Laudanum was a hit among the elite. It's as if being able to access this dangerous, addictive substance made you more fashionable, more proper, more in control of your life. It was a strange kind of glamour, wasn't it? To know that you had a secret that the rest of the world didn't know, and to feel better in ways that only your inner circle would understand. But as the years went on, the cracks started to show. Women who had once been the picture of grace and composure were now plagued with confusion, numbness, and a deepening dependence on their tonic. But did anyone step in and stop it? No, of course not. They simply doubled down. It wasn't until the late 1800s that people began to question laudanum's true effects. And by then, so many lives had been quietly destroyed. Women's bodies and minds, weakened by a century of societal expectations, had fallen prey to something that promised to help them, but only led to their undoing. So, next time you're dealing with your own modern-day stresses, bills, deadlines, your favorite TV show being cancelled, remember that at least you don't have to rely on laudanum to get through the day. You can, however, comfort yourself with the knowledge that, in the grand scheme of things, our modern problems are probably less chemically induced. At least we've traded in lace and opium for therapy, right? Let's take a look at the magical ingredients of laudanum. It's basically just opium dissolved in alcohol, a potent combination of substances that could make you feel like you were floating on a cloud or sinking into a dark abyss. For the uninitiated, this sounds like a very poor life choice, but to the Victorians, it was a miracle cure. I mean, who wouldn't want to feel euphoric while treating their hysteria or nervous conditions? It's almost like someone mixed up the ingredients for a relaxing spa day with those of a nightmare. Let's dig into why this toxic cocktail became the go-to remedy. First things first, laudanum wasn't some rogue creation from a mad scientist's basement. Oh no, it was actually the brainchild of the medical elites, the supposed best minds of the Victorian era, who thought nothing of prescribing their patients a hearty dose of opium and alcohol. Sounds sophisticated, right? This blend of opium from the poppy plant and alcohol was meant to calm the nerves, soothe the body, and even, in some cases, help people sleep. But here's the kicker. While it might make you feel calm and relaxed at first, there was a tiny little issue. It was incredibly addictive. But who's counting? After all, what's a few years of addiction when you're floating around in that lovely haze, right? To understand the allure, you've got to remember that for most people in the Victorian era, life was not exactly a day at the beach. Women, especially, were expected to keep it together at all costs. Your entire self-worth was tied to how composed you appeared in public. And God forbid you ever show any kind of emotion other than polite restraint. If you happened to feel sad, anxious, or, heaven forbid, angry, well, that wasn't acceptable. You were simply told to take a little medicine, and voila, problem solved. So, why not take a potion that could make you feel like you were on a cloud, floating away from all those Victorian responsibilities? Now, let's break down the magic of this concoction. Opium, when consumed, interacts with the brain to relieve pain and produce a feeling of euphoria. It's like an old-timey version of a mood-enhancing vacation, only with less sun and more long-lasting side effects. Opium works by binding to receptors in the brain, triggering the release of dopamine, which makes you feel, well, good. On the other hand, alcohol is a depressant, which means it slows down your central nervous system, making you feel relaxed and, if consumed in large enough quantities, even a little loopy. Combined, these two ingredients created a drug cocktail that worked in perfect harmony to relieve whatever ailments you might have had, whether that be physical or emotional. And let's face it, most of the time, it was emotional. Who knew that anxiety could be treated by knocking yourself unconscious? But here's the real twist. While the immediate effects were pleasurable, the long-term results were a tad less enjoyable. Opium addiction is no joke. While you may have felt like you were floating in the clouds, your body was becoming more and more dependent on this powerful drug. Soon enough, those relaxing moments turned into the frantic need for more and more doses, each one promising to take you back to that blissful, floaty state. But the more you took, the harder it was to reach that same feeling. It's like chasing a high that's constantly slipping through your fingers, leaving you trapped in a never-ending cycle of just one more dose. And let's talk about how laudanum was marketed. Victorian society had a very peculiar relationship with medicines that weren't really medicines at all. Imagine a sleek little bottle of laudanum sitting on a shelf, gleaming like it's the next big thing in wellness. It was fashionable to have it. Doctors were prescribing it as a cure-all for everything from headaches to nervous conditions to, you guessed it, hysteria. A condition that could have simply been called having a bad day as a woman in Victorian England. Need some relief from your nerves? Laudanum. Feeling a little down? Laudanum. It was a lifestyle, not just a remedy. However, If you looked at this so-called medicinal wonder with a modern eye, you'd be questioning the sanity of the entire Victorian medical establishment. It was like giving someone a glass of wine and saying, "Here, this will cure your back pain." Except instead of just a glass of wine, you were getting a cocktail that would leave you in a stupor, vulnerable to addiction, with no clear idea of the long-term consequences. The sad irony of laudanum is that it was not just a bad idea. It was a really bad idea wrapped up in a pretty socially acceptable package. It was the 19th century equivalent of a wellness fad gone horribly wrong, where everyone thought they were doing something good for themselves until they couldn't function without it. At first, it was a solution. By the end, it was a problem, a big problem. So, when you think about it, laudanum wasn't just a drug. It was a symbol of a time that was desperately trying to fix all of its social ills with whatever quick fix it could find. And in the end, it was yet another reminder that sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. Just ask the poor floating Victorian women who thought they were getting relief, only to fall into the deep abyss of addiction. In the mid-1800s, women's health was a bit of a joke, literally. If you were a woman in Victorian England, chances were high that if you were acting out of line, i.e., having any emotion other than demure gratitude for your suffocating life, someone would blame it on your hysteria. And what better cure for this mysterious affliction than a little dose of laudanum? But soon, these doses started pushing women past the brink of just acting a little off and into a full-blown state of madness. Was it the drug? Or was it the oppressive, soul-crushing roles they were stuck in? Either way, it was a bad scene. The Victorian concept of hysteria was a beautiful blend of misogyny, ignorance, and a complete disregard for the actual complexities of women's emotions. It was a diagnosis so vague, you could use it to explain nearly anything that wasn't perfectly prim and proper. Feeling sad? Hysterical? Annoyed that your corset is too tight? Hysterical. Tired of your life? Being controlled by a world that thought your worth was defined by your domestic skills? Hysterical. Basically, any time a woman expressed anything other than complete passivity, she was labeled as hysterical. What a brilliant catch-all term, right? This is where laudanum comes in. Women, who were often considered too delicate to have agency over their own feelings or bodies, were prescribed this opium-infused solution to calm their nerves. In a society where being a proper lady was practically a full-time job, how could you not feel a little off? The weight of social expectation alone could make anyone feel like they were about to snap. But instead of offering support, empathy, or basic human decency, the Victorian medical establishment turned to laudanum as a quick fix for this mysterious condition. And what did they do once it worked? They gave it to you again, and again, and again. Until, surprise, surprise, you needed more and more just to keep up the illusion of calm. But this wasn't just a simple prescription for some mild discomfort. It was a slow descent into a world where addiction was the price of civility. The initial effects of laudanum were nothing short of euphoric. For a woman who spent her days managing a household, being told to drink something that would soothe her nerves, dull the edge of her frustrations, and make her feel a little lighter was a welcome relief. But as the doses grew, so did the side effects. What began as a gentle balm for a woman's nerves soon turned into a deep, numbing haze. But here's the kicker. No one really understood what was happening. The doctors weren't sure why women were getting more and more dependent on this drug. They just assumed it was the only way to keep the hysteria at bay. The effects weren't just physical. They were deeply psychological. Women began to lose their sense of self, becoming shadows of who they once were. They didn't have the words to describe what they were feeling, or even the agency to understand the long-term damage being done. After all, when you're constantly told that your feelings are irrational and hysterical, it's hard to grasp the reality that the treatment itself is the source of the problem. Now, let's zoom out for a second and think about the context of the time. Victorian women were often trapped in rigid roles that expected them to be eternally pleasant, always serving their husbands, tending to their homes, and raising children, all while wearing multiple layers of constricting clothing. Their lives were often devoid of meaning beyond their domestic duties. There was no room for individuality, no space for self-expression, no recognition of personal desire or ambition. Imagine how suffocating that must have felt. And when you finally cracked under the pressure, what was the solution? A dose of laudanum, followed by a polite, "There, now you're cured." But was it the drug that caused these women to lose themselves? Was it the crushing weight of their existence? The more we look into it, the more we realize that laudanum wasn't the only culprit. The real cause of the madness wasn't just the drug. It was the systemic, soul-crushing limitations placed on women. Laudanum was just the vehicle that allowed society to continue pretending everything was fine, while women quietly sank deeper into a world that wasn't designed for them to thrive in. It's like giving someone a quick fix for an issue that's fundamentally about their entire life being out of balance. Sure, the quick fix might help for a while, but it's the underlying issue that's truly doing the damage. And to add insult to injury, no one talked about it. No one addressed the real problem. The fact that women weren't allowed to feel, express, or exist outside of society's narrow expectations. No, it was always just hysteria, and the answer was always laudanum. The irony is almost unbearable. These women were slighted by a society that demanded they be quiet, passive, and perfect, while simultaneously giving them a drug to numb any real reaction to that very treatment. So, was it the drug that pushed women into madness, or was it the environment they were forced to exist in? The answer, of course, is both. Laudanum played its part, but it was the suffocating roles women were locked into that truly set the stage for their downfall. In the end, it wasn't just the drug, it was the entire system that needed to be healed. Unfortunately, that would take more than just a dose of medicine. We've all been there, right? That one friend who can't stop talking about the new thing they're addicted to. Fancy coffee, overpriced workout gear, or obscure podcasts. But in Victorian times, people were literally addicted to laudanum, and it wasn't just one person's problem. Entire segments of society were trapped in the spiral of addiction, all because their doctors had said it was a good idea. Let's explore the dark side of a society obsessed with medicinal miracles that led to a massive public health crisis. Because nothing says, "We've got this whole medicine thing figured out," like an entire generation getting hooked on a narcotic. At first glance, it might seem almost charming, right? The idea of walking down a Victorian street, seeing people sipping their laudanum like it was the latest trendy tea. Everyone's doing it. Your neighbor, your cousin, your favorite socialite. It's the must-have health elixir, a miracle in a bottle. What could go wrong? Well, fast forward a few years, and suddenly it's not so charming anymore. In fact, it's downright terrifying. The addiction was real, and the consequences were devastating. Let's break it down. Laudanum was basically the Victorian version of modern-day fast food. It was quick, easy, and readily available. And just like fast food, it didn't exactly do wonders for your health. It wasn't just a little addictive, it was downright insidious. As the drug made its way into more and more homes, it started to wreak havoc in ways that people couldn't even begin to comprehend. At first, people were given small doses to treat all sorts of ailments, everything from pain, anxiety and coughs to menstrual cramps and insomnia. A little sip here, a little dose there. What could possibly be the harm? But that's the thing about laudanum. It didn't just cure problems, it created them. At first, you felt better. But then the relief started to wear off, and soon enough, you found yourself reaching for that next dose just to feel normal. The trick, of course, was that it wasn't just physical dependency that set in. It was mental too. People didn't just crave laudanum because their bodies had grown accustomed to it. They craved it because it became the only way they could feel better. Over time, this little dose of relief became a regular part of life for many. And before long, it wasn't enough to just take it for a headache. It became the crutch that got you through every part of your day. But here's where things get even darker. Laudanum wasn't just confined to the lower classes or the sickly poor. It had a firm grip on all levels of Victorian society. Doctors, society elites, even royalty were all dependent on it. The addiction had no boundaries, no class system. If you had money and a prescription pad, you were just as likely to get hooked as someone in a grimy alleyway. It was a society-wide issue, and no one knew how deep the problem went until it was too late. The worst part was that laudanum was widely prescribed by doctors who thought they were doing something helpful. They weren't malicious. They were simply working with the limited knowledge of the time. The general consensus among medical professionals was that it was a safe, effective treatment. The idea of addiction wasn't even on their radar. To them, it was just a helpful solution that made people feel better, a miracle cure for so many ailments. The fact that it was also a highly addictive narcotic was conveniently overlooked. It was only later, after society had already spiraled into widespread dependency, that the true cost of their cure became evident. So what happened when people started to realize the full extent of laudanum's grip on society? Well, not much at first. The medical community was slow to act. The cultural norm was still firmly in place. Pop a little laudanum when you're feeling off and you'll feel fine. But soon, the symptoms of addiction began to show themselves. Tremors, fatigue, mood swings, and, perhaps most tragically, the loss of personal autonomy. Women in particular suffered under this burden, having been prescribed laudanum for everything from hysteria to nervous disorders. But no one noticed the damage until entire families were caught in the grip of a drug that had become as common as tea. Now, imagine the frustration and confusion. People were stuck in this fog of addiction, unable to see the chains that bound them. It's like being trapped in a maze, but you're so used to it that you don't even realize the walls are closing in. You start taking it for a cold, but then you need it to function. You think it's just helping you sleep, but suddenly you can't sleep without it. And you tell yourself, I'll just have one more dose. And then the cycle repeats, over and over again. In the end, laudanum didn't just wreck the health of individuals. It wrecked the fabric of society itself. It became a symbol of an era that mistook instant relief for long-term wellness. A time when people were willing to put their trust in anything that promised to make them feel better, even if it meant losing their freedom along the way. Laudanum was supposed to be a solution, but it turned out to be just another symptom of a much larger problem. A society that couldn't see the true cost of its own medical miracles. But as with all good things or bad decisions, this too came to an end. By the turn of the 20th century, people started to realize that maybe, just maybe, using opium as medicine wasn't the greatest idea. The fallout from this widespread addiction was devastating, and the Victorians had to come to terms with the fact that their miracle cure had wreaked havoc on their society. But let's be honest, this all sounds like a bad night out in the 21st century, except with more lace and fewer smartphones. Time to wrap up this story with a reminder that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, and sometimes the disease is just really bad advice. As the 19th century came to a close, people started to wake up to the fact that maybe, just maybe, they had been a little too quick to trust a drug that came with a hefty dose of euphoria and a steep price of dependence. The addictive properties of laudanum were becoming increasingly obvious, but by then, the damage had already been done. This wasn't just a handful of addicted individuals, it was an entire generation. Doctors, society elites, and even regular folks were hooked on the drug, unaware of just how deeply it had embedded itself into their daily lives. At first, no one really noticed. People didn't think of laudanum as a threat because it was, after all, prescribed by trusted medical professionals. It was sold openly in stores, recommended by doctors, and marketed as a safe, effective cure for almost anything. Headaches, pain, anxiety, or even something as vague as nervous afflictions. In the beginning, it was a godsend. The euphoria felt like a blessing after a day of overwhelming domestic duties, societal pressure, or just the general misery of Victorian life. But soon, laudanum went from being a miracle cure to a symbol of all the things society didn't want to acknowledge. The addiction wasn't just physical. It started to affect the very fabric of Victorian society. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the initial bliss that came from a dose of laudanum was starting to wear off, and the long-term consequences of the addiction began to show. Women, who were particularly vulnerable to this societal trap, had their lives upended by the very drug that was supposed to make them feel better. The effects of laudanum addiction ranged from depression and anxiety to full-blown physical deterioration. It wasn't just the elite that suffered either. The working class felt the devastating effects too, as they were introduced to cheaper, less regulated versions of the drug. Families were torn apart as addictions spread, and the damage became impossible to ignore. It wasn't long before medical professionals started to reconsider their stance. As the public grew more aware of the dangers of laudanum, the medical community could no longer ignore the disastrous effects. Public health campaigns began to raise awareness, and by the early 20th century, laudanum was officially viewed as a dangerous narcotic, banned from mainstream use. It was too late for many, though. The damage was done. An entire generation had been raised on a drug that, while effective in the short term, had devastating long-term consequences. But perhaps the most tragic part of it all was the realization that, for many, their addiction had been encouraged, even prescribed, by the very people they trusted most. Looking back, it's almost comical in its absurdity. The Victorians had convinced themselves that laudanum was the answer to all of life's problems. But in hindsight, it's clear that the cure wasn't just worse than the disease. It was the disease itself. The true epidemic wasn't just the addiction, but the complete failure to recognize that sometimes cures don't come in bottles. Sometimes the solution to societal problems is not found in the bottom of a glass, but in reform, in addressing the roots of pain, and in the awareness that the body and mind aren't easily fooled by quick fixes. As we sit in the comfort of our modern lives, free from corsets and opium-laced tonics, we can't help but reflect on the ridiculousness of it all. It's almost as if we too are on the verge of some new miracle cure that promises to solve all our modern woes. And when we look back on our own time, will we laugh at how blindly we trusted the latest fad, the latest quick fix? Will we eventually come to understand that sometimes the best cure is a little patience and a whole lot of common sense? One can only hope. So as we settle into our cozy modern beds tonight, let's take a moment to be grateful for all the things that have changed. Sure, we might have our own quick fixes and misguided trends, but at least we don't have laudanum to deal with. And that, my friends, is progress. So, as we lie in our warm, comfy beds tonight, with indoor plumbing and clean sheets, let's take a moment to appreciate the small wonders of modern life. Things that we often take for granted. No laudanum to knock us out cold, no doctors handing out bottles of opium to make us feel better about the chaos of existence. And yet, as ridiculous as it sounds, the Victorians weren't all that different from us. They too were looking for a quick fix, a way to escape the burdens of life, just with a bit more lace and a lot fewer options for self-care. It's wild to think that an entire generation fell victim to a miracle cure that, in the end, did more harm than good. And yet, it's a reminder of how often history repeats itself. We all want a quick solution to our problems, something that will ease our minds, calm our fears, and make everything just a little bit easier. But sometimes it's the long road, the one with a bit of patience and some hard work, that gets us to a real solution. So tonight, as you tuck into your clean bed with hot water and indoor plumbing, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors, who survived lice, leeches, and soup that might kill you. Because, while history may be gross and terrifying, it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and kind of ridiculous. The Victorians were just doing the best they could with what they had, and honestly, we're probably not that different. After all, we've all tried a little laudanum of our own, whether it's the latest fad, the newest gadget, or just a little escape from the mess of life. Now, as you settle in and drift off to sleep, remember, history might be a little grim, but it's also pretty hilarious when you look at it from the comfort of modern-day living. And that's something worth smiling about as you head into dreamland. Sweet dreams, and may your night be free of any mysterious opium-based cures. Okay, good night.